What if almost everything you believe about the world is only an appearance? What if the things you can see, touch, and hear are not the deepest reality? More than 2,000 years ago, one man spent his life asking questions like these. His name was Plato. He was not a king. He did not command an army, yet his ideas would survive empires, wars, and entire civilizations. And even today, people are still asking the questions he asked. Plato was born into the world of ancient Athens, a city filled with politics, philosophy, art, ambition, and conflict. He grew up in a society that valued public debate. Men gathered in marketplaces and public spaces to argue about justice, government, courage, and the meaning of a good life. For a young man like Plato, Athens was more than a city. It was a living classroom. And somewhere inside that classroom, he would meet the person who changed the direction of his entire life. That person was Socrates. Socrates had no grand school building and no impressive collection of books. Instead, he simply asked questions. When someone claimed to be wise, Socrates would ask them to explain what they really meant. When someone claimed to understand justice, he would ask what justice actually was. And when their answers began to collapse, Socrates would keep asking. Plato watched carefully. He was learning something more powerful than an ordinary lesson. He was learning how to question certainty itself. To many people, this kind of questioning was frustrating. Imagine believing you understand something completely, only to discover that you cannot explain it. That was the experience Socrates created again and again. But for Plato, confusion was not the enemy. It was the beginning of wisdom. The young philosopher began to understand that the first step toward knowledge might be admitting that you do not know as much as you thought. That lesson would become one of the foundations of Plato's philosophy. But Plato was growing up during a dangerous time. Athens was involved in the long and devastating Peloponnesian War. The city that had once appeared powerful and confident was now struggling with defeat, political instability, and fear. Plato was seeing something important. A society could be brilliant and still make terrible decisions. A city could value democracy and still be manipulated by emotion, ambition, and anger. And these experiences would eventually force Plato to ask one of his greatest questions: what makes a society truly just? Then came the event that would change Plato forever. Socrates was put on trial. He was accused of corrupting the young and failing to respect the city's traditional beliefs. To Plato, the trial was more than the punishment of one man. It was a terrifying example of what could happen when a society became convinced that it was right. Socrates was sentenced to death, and Plato watched the teacher he admired disappear from the world. The death of Socrates left a wound in Plato's thinking, but it also gave him a mission. If a wise man could be condemned by his own city, then perhaps the problem was deeper than one unfair trial. Perhaps people needed to understand justice before they could create a just society. Perhaps leaders needed knowledge, not simply popularity. And perhaps the human mind needed to learn how to separate truth from appearance. Plato would spend the rest of his life exploring these ideas. After the death of Socrates, Plato did not simply return home and forget the past. He traveled. He encountered different cultures, different political systems, and different intellectual traditions. The journeys expanded his understanding of the world. He saw that people in different places could hold completely different beliefs about government, morality, religion, and human nature. And this raised another question. If people can believe completely different things, how do we know which beliefs are actually true? Plato became increasingly interested in the difference between opinion and knowledge. An opinion can change. It can be influenced by fear, desire, popularity, or appearances. But Plato believed genuine knowledge had to reach something deeper. He began to search for realities that did not change as easily as the world around us. What is justice? What is beauty? What is goodness? These were not simply words to Plato. They were problems that could occupy an entire lifetime. Eventually, Plato returned to Athens, and there he created something that would become one of the most influential intellectual institutions of the ancient world, the Academy. It was not a modern university. There were no classrooms in the way we know them today. Instead, students gathered to discuss mathematics, philosophy, nature, politics, and the human mind. Plato had transformed his questions into a community of learning. Plato did not want his students simply to memorize answers. He wanted them to learn how to think. A student might begin with an easy question: what is courage? But then came another question: is courage always good? What if a person is brave for the wrong reason? And suddenly, the simple answer was no longer simple. This was the method that Plato had inherited from Socrates. The goal was not to make thinking comfortable. The goal was to make thinking deeper. Plato also believed that the visible world was not the whole story. Look at a beautiful object. It may be beautiful today, but it can break tomorrow. Look at a fair decision. People may later disagree about whether it was truly fair. Plato wondered whether there were perfect realities behind these imperfect examples. He called these deeper realities forms. The things we see might change, but the idea behind them could point towards something more permanent. For Plato, the search for knowledge was therefore a journey. A person begins with what the senses provide. They see objects, they hear sounds, they experience pleasure and pain. But philosophy asks the mind to go further, to compare, to reason, to question, and eventually to search for principles that do not depend entirely on what happens to be visible at this moment. Knowledge, Plato believed, required the mind to turn towards something deeper. Plato's most famous image of this problem is the Allegory of the cave. Imagine people living inside a dark cave. They have been there for so long that all they can see are shadows moving across a wall. To them, those shadows are reality. They have never seen anything else. Then imagine one person escaping. For the first time, he sees the world outside, the sun, the trees, the sky, and suddenly he understands that the shadows were never the whole truth. But the story doesn't end there. Imagine that the person who escaped returns to the cave. He tries to explain what he has seen. Would the others believe him? Probably not. They might think he has become confused. They might even become angry at him. For Plato, this was a powerful image of education. Learning is not simply filling an empty mind with information. Sometimes it means turning the mind around and forcing it to see differently. And this brought Plato back to politics. If ordinary people could be influenced by appearances, emotion, and persuasion, what kind of person should lead a society? Plato was deeply suspicious of leaders who wanted power simply because they wanted to be powerful. He imagined a different kind of ruler, someone who had spent years learning discipline, mathematics, philosophy, and the nature of justice.
someone who wanted truth more than a clause. He called this ideal the Philosopher-King. Plato believed education should shape the whole person. The body needed discipline, the mind needed training, and character needed guidance. A person who knew mathematics but lacked self-control could still become dangerous. A person who possessed political power but did not understand justice could become even more dangerous. For Plato, knowledge without character was not enough.
The goal was to create people capable of controlling themselves before attempting to control others. Interestingly, Plato did not present most of his philosophy as dry textbooks. Instead, he wrote dialogues. Characters questioned one another, arguments developed, ideas collided, and often there was no simple final answer. This made his writing feel almost like a conversation happening across time. A reader could enter the discussion and begin asking the same questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is love? What is knowledge? And what makes a human life worth living? Plato's greatest works, The Republic, explored many of these questions. It was not simply a book about government. It was an investigation into the human soul, education, justice, leadership, and the nature of a good life. Plato imagined a society divided according to different functions and abilities. But beneath the political discussion was a deeper idea. A society becomes better when its people understand their responsibilities and when reason, rather than uncontrolled desire, guides their actions. Plato's ideas about politics were not only theoretical. He became involved with political figures in Sicily. He hoped philosophy might influence real leadership, but reality was far more complicated than theory. Political power does not easily surrender to philosophical wisdom. Plato discovered that teaching rulers to love truth was much harder than describing the idea of a perfect ruler. His experiences in Sicily were frustrating, but they also demonstrated something important. Ideas become very different when they meet the real world. Plato eventually returned to Athens and continued teaching. By now, he was no longer the young man who had watched Socrates walk toward his death. He had become a teacher himself. Generations of students had passed through the academy. His questions had become their questions, and one of those students would later become famous in his own right. His name was Aristotle. Aristotle would eventually develop ideas that differed from his teacher. That difference is important. Plato had taught him to question, but Aristotle would build his own approach to nature, logic, science, politics, and ethics. This is one of the strange powers of a great teacher. The student does not have to become a copy of the teacher. Sometimes the greatest student is the one who learns how to disagree. Plato spent his final years teaching and writing. We do not know every detail of his final days. The ancient sources disagree about some parts of his life. But one thing is clear. His influence was already becoming larger than the man himself. His students carried his questions forward. His writings survived, and the academy continued after his death. Plato's physical life would end. His arguments would not. Plato died around the middle of the 4th century before Christ. More than 2,000 years have passed since then. Athens changed, empires rose and disappeared, languages changed, libraries burned, kingdoms vanished, yet Plato's questions survived. That may be the most remarkable part of his story. He did not leave behind an empire, he left behind problems, and sometimes a powerful question can survive longer than a powerful king. Think about how often we confuse appearance with reality. A person looks successful, so we assume they are happy. A crowd believes something, so we assume it must be true. A powerful speaker sounds confident, so we assume he must be right. Plato would tell us to stop, ask another question, then another. Do not accept an idea simply because everyone around you accepts it. The habit of questioning may be uncomfortable, but that discomfort may be the beginning of understanding. The cave is still powerful because it is not only about ancient Greece, it can describe any human being. We all have assumptions, we all have beliefs we rarely examine. We all have ideas that feel obvious simply because we have heard them for years. The challenge is not to question everything blindly. It is to learn which beliefs deserve evidence, which deserve reason, and which deserve to be changed. That is the difficult journey from appearance toward understanding. Perhaps this is why Plato remains relevant. He reminds us that intelligence is not simply knowing many facts. Wisdom begins when we recognize the limits of our own understanding. The smartest person in the room may not be the person with the quickest answer. It may be the person willing to ask the better question. And that lesson began with a philosopher who inherited one simple habit from Socrates: never stop examining what you think you know.